entrepreneurial, most corrupt, highest tax evading nation amongst the 17. If Greece had not entered the Eurozone in 2000, it would have started somewhere else. Greece is not significant enough even to discuss now, except if you're Greek and you're suffering because of the suffering of your people. But any discussion of the crisis in Greece, of the Greek crisis, which is separate from the Irish. You know, with this amazing misanthropic geography now in Europe. The Irish are trying to convince the world that they're not Greeks, the Portuguese that they're not Irish, the Spanish that they're not Portuguese, and the Italians that they're Germans.
Thank you very much. Some of my students here, and you know what, they say, Natalie, you're so negative, you're so negative. I now know what I'm going to tell them. I read Yanis's blog, that's why. But look, we're going to take questions. However, I must stress, our speaker has a flight to catch, and we've got to be ultra-disciplined about it. So what I suggest, there'll be group questions, right?
Half an hour.
Yeah,
if we are out of here in half an hour.
I think we still need to group questions.
Okay, let's group.
Because that makes it more efficient. You can address the question at the one time, and that means that everybody will get a chance to ask a question. So we had a question here. Is anybody else who wants to ask a question? 2. I'll take a third. This is like an auction. Yes.
3, 4.
Okay. So there's 3. Here, here, and here. If you can please put your question, and then Yanis will answer.
Thank you for the discussion and the presentation. But my question is, as a Greek, I would like to ask why would Greece, or the group of people, or the type of country, has allowed itself to be in this position? Now, I don't want, and we all know the excuses because of this happened, and this may, if it was different, and the Germans, if the others. My question is, you know, we've been there, and we've been all the difficult. Why have we allowed this economy, this small economy, this tiny economy, to remain corrupt, ineffective, with all these straight losses and all of that?
Okay, so that's the first question. Second question?
Oh, me? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's probably related. You know, I'm from the Netherlands. I'm familiar with Finland and mostly the Nordic countries. And even though I live here for a long, long time, and it's related, you know, people work their arse off there, whilst in Greece they didn't. You know, people have paid less for taxes, there's a work ethic, there's all these things. And so the economy of the Netherlands and the economy of Finland, for instance, you know, particularly, have themselves been very buoyantly well prepared for not having to cop all this shit. So, again, you know, it is understandable that you may well be right, the thing will fall apart. I think that those countries are magical and Germany will survive, and good luck to them.
Which countries?
Well, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden. And they will survive, and there'll be some upheaval, sure.
Andrew, third one, and then you are the third.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the rise of the political formations in Europe, such as Syriza, which have policies which are pretty similar to the proposals that you have. For instance, Euro bonds and the investment bank working with member states. Well, one of their proposals would be for the member state to increase the taxes on the high-end brackets. For instance, apparently there's 2,000 families in Greece that own something like 60% of the wealth. I don't know if that's true or not, perhaps you can elaborate on it. But if they were to tax these families, then they could be able to work with the investment bank or something like that. So I was just wondering if you could comment on the political side of the debate.
Can I group myself with this group of questions because it is really relevant?
No, I think we've only got 2 questions. I don't think that for each person. I'll take another 3. Okay, so just hold on to your question.
Okay.
And
Right.
you'll be the first off.
Why did we allow our country to reach this bottomless pit and to be the first domino to fall? If you recall, Greece, even up to 1980, had the lowest debt ratio in Europe. Both public ratio, debt ratio, and private. In the 1950s, beginning with the Marshall Plan, the Greek economy, which was completely and utterly devastated following a very long war, much longer than anybody else because we had the Civil War to contend with as well, went through a period of a mini industrial revolution. We had a mini industrial revolution in the 50s and early 60s. The tragedy was that it was a paternalistic state. So the new industries that were created were led by the same families whose brothers or sisters, not sisters, unfortunately, yeah. Brothers were in government. So you had the same family, one industrialist, one minister. Okay? So it was a flimsy industrial revolution, but nevertheless it was an industrial revolution. Wages were dirt low, but cheap. Half of the Greek population migrated to Australia, and Canada, and Germany, and America, and everywhere, right? And Belgium even. They were sending remittances back. Greek growth between 1950 and 1995 was the fastest in Europe. It started at a very low level, right? So none of the things that we are discussing here are recognizable from looking at the history of Greece between 1950 and 1980, let's say. So what happened? What happened was that the Bretton Woods system died in 1971. The oil crisis began, and at the time when Greece was exiting the dark days of our neo-fascist dictatorship in 1974, the late 1970s, and the people of Greece were beginning to aspire to a more liberal life, and the freedoms and rights that Europe was taking for granted. At that time, the industry that was built in the 1950s unraveled. And unraveled for two reasons. Firstly, because of oil prices. They were dependent entirely on foreign oil and at an exchange rate which suddenly divided very badly after the collapse of Bretton Woods. And secondly, because the aspirations of the Greek elite at the time, rightly or wrongly, I'm not going to judge it, was to become part of Europe. So Greece started the process of trying to cajole France in particular to let us into the European common market at the time, which meant reducing or eliminating quotas and tariffs, all the protections of the Greek industry. So you had increased costs, removal of protection, Greek industry died. Our entry to the European Union coincided with the elimination of our industry. And remember, we didn't have a welfare state at all. So suddenly we had this massive increase in unemployment at a time when the political elites had to contend with an uppity electorate that wanted to have a say in the running of our own affairs after a period of dark age, political, dictatorial dark ages. And what they did in order to cope with this was effectively to shift the losses from the private sector onto the public sector. And this is the story of the Greek tragedy. The losses of the industries that were dying were shifted onto the public sector. But in other words, there was no unemployment benefit, really. So what they did was, under pressure from the electorate, somebody who lost their job in the textile industry, in making washing machines, were hired by the state doing nothing, instead of an unemployment benefit. That was the beginning of the end. Unfortunately, the 1990s was also a period where Wall Street, the City of London, and Frankfurt was producing a lot of money, private money, oodles of it. And that capital was receiving very little returns in the metropolis of Europe and the United States. They had to find an outlet to it. It was seeking higher returns. So it came into places like Greece, especially after the euro happened for us, which gave this semblance of equal risk everywhere in the Eurozone. German, American, even some Spanish capital came into Greece in search of higher returns because Greece was a riskier proposition, so they would get higher interest rates. Okay? So suddenly we had a shrinking industry, increasing living standards on borrowed money. Okay? That's my answer to your question. You mentioned Northern European countries saying that they work very hard. You see, I have no doubt that the Dutch, the German, the Finnish workers feel precisely this way. But you know what? One thing that 1929 should teach us, in addition to everything else I said, is that stereotypes are putting us on a very slippery slope towards racism. And racism happens the moment you start beginning sentences with the Dutch or the Greeks. There is no such thing as the Dutch. And there is no such thing as the Greeks. I know lots of Greeks who work very hard, and I know quite a few Dutch people who do nothing. Now, you may say that the vast majority of the working class in Holland is a lot more productive than the vast majority of the working class in Greece. Completely correct. But when you have a destruction of the industrial sector of Greece, and those people had no jobs to go to, they were hired in some public sector job that they had nothing to do, how could you expect them to be productive? When Greeks leave Greece, as you know from Australia, they become quite productive. So it's not in their DNA. That's why I'm saying we should be very careful about stereotypes. Now, Aesop told us the story of the ant and the grasshopper. It's a great tale about frugality and about the importance of working hard, but also of learning how to enjoy your life. Because the ant died without having experienced the moment's happiness ever. And that's always the thing I do. The problem with metaphors like allegories like Aesop's is that when we use them in a national context, we miss the point. I won't talk about Holland, but I will in a minute. But first, let's take the German worker. The German worker has a very good reason for being angry at this very moment in time. Because for the last 15 years, the average German worker has been squeezed into the ground with very low real wages, negative real wage growth. You have a doubling and trebling of the proportion of working poor in Germany. Their services in their local hospital, local social welfare facilities are dying. And they hear the government saying that they will give 100, 200 billion to the Greek government, when they know that the Greeks don't pay taxes, they don't work as efficiently, they produce no cars, they can't see any Greek washing machines being sold in Holland or in Germany. I understand that. But this is analytically utterly misleading. Because what happened was, in Greece, in order for Greece to enter into the European Union, into the Eurozone, let me tell you that the number of hours of those with jobs increased to a level which is 60% higher than the average in Germany. Greeks who tried to make ends meet during the 90s and early 2000s worked 2 jobs. And their take-home pay was actually going down in real terms, even though statistics reported that it was going up. Why? Because of the way inflation is coming. The inflation of the working class in Greece was 10%, when the official inflation rate was 2 and 3 and 4%. Why? Because interest rates were coming down. So if you had a very big car in the northern suburbs of Athens and you had a mortgage, your inflation was negative. But if you lived on rent and you worked in the supermarket and you caught the bus, your inflation rate was 10%. So effectively what I'm saying is this. The Euro crisis is, if you want to moralize and blame it on something, is the result of a conspiracy between the grasshoppers of Germany and the grasshoppers of Greece against the ants of Germany and the ants of Greece. Now about Holland. Of course we will all survive. We survived the Black Death in Europe. We survived the Second World War. All our countries will survive. Greece will survive, Holland will survive. My problem is, and this is my protestation too, that we're going through an unnecessary crisis. And if the euro goes, we're going to go through an unnecessarily lost generation, both of Dutch people and Greek. It is insane to waste human lives like this and to waste generations, when we don't have to do this. As long as we understand what the structural nature of this crisis is, and to understand that this is not a question of pointing fingers at one another as nations, who can, I believe in pointing fingers at one another as individuals. So when I see somebody in Greece who is corrupt, a bureaucrat, destroys people's lives by being corrupt as a bureaucrat, okay, I have every right, and I think it's my moral obligation to point a moralizing finger at him or her. But when we start saying the Greeks or the Dutch, we miss the point and we create problems. I did say I was going to say something about Holland. Do you know that in Holland you have, or your competitors compatriots have the highest private debt ratio. Do you know that most of Holland's banks are bankrupt? If this crisis is allowed to continue while we are pointing fingers at each other, Holland is going to be in big trouble. It will survive. But why should we waste this generation? Third question. You asked me to comment on Syriza. I guess I'm in agreement with some of their policies, including especially the one about the European Investment Bank. But let me confess to a crime here. It's because I wrote some of them for them. The one about the taxation part, I disagree with. And that is very, very simple. The ones who actually, rich Greeks are not domiciled in Greece. So it's actually, it's a waste of breath even to talk about taxing them. They're not there.
Okay, so a lady here, one here, that's three. So we'll take this one, and this one.
It's okay, I just wanted to ask about the situation, the economic situation in Poland, in Finland, in Austria, maybe in these countries, but I think that's
Okay.
you also referred to something.
Next one.
I actually wanted to ask about one of the solutions that you suggested, which was foreign investment outside of the Eurobloc. How do you go around monitoring that and to have even the confidence of coming or raising that confidence? Because clearly if they step up again and you've got other countries invested, like China, like the BRIC countries, you're going to have a World War III or IV, whatever, should that happen again, because you've got obviously a lot larger investments coming through from there. Just an opinion on that.
Okay.
Okay, third one.
Mine kind of relates to that, and also what you were mentioning before about the like the destruction of Greek industry. If the Eurozone and say Greece in particular are meant to pick themselves up again, how can, like, what sort of competitive advantage can they have against manufacturing nodes in some sort of industry, or comparative advantage with countries such as China? How exactly are these countries meant to compete again? What can they bring in again?
Okay, firstly, regarding the surplus countries and their economy. Germany, Holland, and Finland do not have the capacity to absorb the output of their gleaming, beautiful manufacturing industry. They rely on net exports. Now, between 1949, 50, whatever, and 2008, it was the United States of America that was generating the demand worldwide, including China's demand, for their net exports, as well as the rest of Europe. The deficit part of Europe was essential in providing up to 70% of the effective demand in order to keep the German, Finnish, Austrian, and Dutch manufacturers going. The problem is that after 2008, the United States of America lost that capacity. This is why the whole globe is in this state of bewilderment at the moment, because about $1 trillion, I mentioned that, about $1 trillion worth of demand is missing. Demand that was being generated by the United States of America, and the United States of America has lost its capacity since 2008. China is doing an excellent job from 2008 to today with huge stimulus packages, maintaining its growth, and Germany has benefited a lot from that. And let's not forget that Holland and Austria are parasitic from Germany, as is Poland and Slovakia. But this is ebbing, and China is not going to be able to continue doing this because its own consumption ratio has fallen below 30%. And now the extremely high levels of investment are fueling bubbles whose bursting is going to bring down the dragon. So they're very worried about that, and therefore they're not going to keep investing at the same rate. So Germany is not going to be able to look forward to this kind of thing. So, to cut a long story short, Finland, Holland, and Germany, at least the intelligent people that are running the show in the industrial sectors and also in the financial sectors, are extremely worried. They can't sleep at night because of this fear. You mentioned about, you said, where is the foreign investment going to come from in the Eurozone? Well, let me tell you something that we economists neglect to stress. When a huge crisis like that of 29 or 2008 happens, yes, you have a mountain of debts and banking losses. But there is another facet of the crisis which we never see. Nobody talks about it. We have an equal mountain of idle savings. How would you feel if I were to tell you, and this is why I said that anybody who says that this is a sovereign debt crisis, they really have missed the point. It is a crisis of sovereign debt, but it's also, I could describe the crisis as a crisis of too many savings. How would that sound? Would this sound absurd? It's not. It's the other side of the same coin. You have savings that are piling up, nowhere to go, because they're scared of what will happen if they get invested, and there's no demand for it, for the output that will be produced as a result of those investments. If the ECB were to issue its own bonds in the context of the proposal of my proposal before, I can assure you that they will be snapped up by Chinese sovereign wealth funds, Norwegian sovereign wealth funds, mums and dads in Japan, German investors who have nothing to fall back on. At the moment, they buy US Treasury bills, they buy Japanese debt, even though or keep cash. You have European banks parking their money at negative interest rates with the ECB instead of lending it. So the money is there. And what we need to do is to recycle the savings with the debts in order to make those two mountains cancel each other out. Finally, what can Greece provide the rest of the world with beyond the crisis? Well, I think that I could give you the standard boring answers like tourism, shipping. Can't bother. I think that the greatest asset that Greece has is a highly educated population. I've taught in many parts of the world, Sydney being one, and I can assure you that the quality of education of our youngsters is second to none, internationally. It is true.
Finland is the top.
According to whom? League tables?
OECD?
Yes,
Come on.
I said second to none.
If you look
I
at
didn't
the
say it's the best. Finland is a very highly, I mean, look, I have a very
There's good reason for that.
Yes, I have a very high respect for the Finnish public education system. Very high respect. And I've studied quite significantly, and I know that it works very well. But let me tell you that Greece has a very significant proportion of highly educated people with, masters and PhDs from Britain, from America, from everywhere. The tragedy that we're experiencing now is that we're losing it. The second wave of emigration is these people. And once we lose them and they start having families abroad, they're gone.
I think we have time for 3 more questions. If you keep them brief, please. 1, is there any other? 2, 3, gone. Out for a sneaking a 4th, but you've got to be really, really brief,
But I'll be
okay?
brief in my answer.
This is not a question, but an observation.
Okay.
Last week I read the New York Times, and the chief superintendent of the police force in Detroit publicly announced that people entering this Detroit CBD enter at their own peril. Okay? So we can talk about Greece, but we have to look at what's going on around the world. So Greece is just, as far as I can see, just a scapegoat for the mismanagement, for the way the financial global system has gone off the rails. That's all I can say. So we can all find Greece as a scapegoat and say the Greeks are, all the people that I know in Greece, they work 2 jobs. A first cousin of mine had twins 3 months ago, and she's now working. She's not trying to avoid taxes or avoid her parental duties.
Have you got your question? Okay, cool. Can we move on to the second question?
I just want to ask, as you said, we're all waiting for the Germans to decide. Do we have any knowledge of what the decision is going to be, or how they're going to, what it's going to be based on, just an economical, or when? Yes.
Okay, the third question, which sorry, I forgot who was the third. I know the fourth was there, but there was a third in here. Yes, you, sorry.
Just simply, where did it all start to go wrong? Was the euro always a flawed idea?
For the Hartz reforms.
Okay, and the fourth?
And the fourth, the gentleman.
Yeah, I just want to stand in on point you point out is that by not losing the generation of a whole life, of losing a whole 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and losing all the qualified people of stepping out to different countries, like ourselves who've been here, whatever we do, what Greece can do to stop those people staying there, to open some doors and they can see tomorrow, there's another day, there's a light in the tunnel, because at the moment everybody is desperate to take a ticket and say bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for the questions. Firstly, regarding your example of Detroit, since you mentioned Detroit, I want to make a comparison between Greece and the United States subprime market. Greece is to Europe that which the subprime market was to the United States. It's very simple. Does it make sense to moralize about those Americans who couldn't afford their homes but nevertheless took heavy mortgages in order to get them? Do it, but it's analytically uninteresting. And it doesn't actually help understand why Lehman Brothers went down. The question about Germany, when can we expect an answer? I have no idea. You see, I'm an economist. I don't know what politicians are up to, but what I do know is that there is a titanic clash within Germany between Frankfurt's banks that are quite keen to see the euro unravel, because if it does, then there will be a huge capital flight into their banks, which will mask their genuine black holes in their asset books, and the German industry that is terrified by the prospect of the collapse of the euro. At the same time, you have the Bundesbank, Mr. Weidmann, who is not entirely in control of the Bundesbank, and he's trying to push the Bundesbank in the direction of the Deutschmark, while Mr. Schäuble and Mrs. Merkel are putting the brakes on, because they haven't decided which is the best way for them to win the 2013 election. Search me, I have no idea how this will end. Where did it all go wrong, you asked me? Was it in the design of the euro? I will not answer it myself. I will relate a story that I like relating because I think it's very poignant. A colleague and friend of mine, Stuart Holland, was part and parcel of the design of the euro in the early 90s. He was a member of parliament in Britain, and then he was an aide to Jacques Delors during the time when they were creating the euro. He tells me the story when he actually wrote the green paper that Jacques Delors adopted. And it's quite a famous one, because he was actually talking about Eurobonds back then, in 1992. And he tells me the story of a meeting between Jacques Delors and President Mitterrand. They're in a room, Stuart is there, Delors is there, Mitterrand is there. And Delors is presenting our green paper to Mitterrand, trying to convince him that unless something like that, Eurobonds with the European Investment Bank, no idea is new, it's regurgitated and developed. Unless we do that, then we will be like creating a building that has no way of surviving an earthquake. And Delors presented this to Mitterrand for about 40-45 minutes. He was speaking, Mitterrand was listening very carefully. At the end, there was a pause for about 5 minutes. And Delors and Stuart Holland were waiting for the great man to speak. And at some point he said, Jacques, you're absolutely right, but we're not going to do it. And we're not going to do it because we don't have the political class to do it at the moment. Helmut Kohl and I are capable of bashing heads together to create a monetary union, but we can't do what you're saying, even though you're right. But don't worry, because when in 10 or 15 years' time there is an international financial crisis, our successors will do that. Unfortunately, he was wrong. They don't seem to be willing to do it. And what can Greece do to get out of this? This is where I'm not going to tell you why I'm extremely unpopular in my country amongst a certain number of subset of the population. Because people ask me that question, and I give their own answer. The answer is nothing. Imagine you were in Tasmania in 1933. and you had a town hall meeting like this one, and you were to ask the simple question, what can Tasmania do to get out of the Great Depression? The answer is nothing. You can't. Once you're caught in it, mind you, it's not precisely true. What the Greek government should have done 3 years ago, 2 years ago, a year ago, today, is effectively campaign for its own bankruptcy. To stop this Ponzi scheme of borrowing with more austerity that demands more borrowing, that gives rise to demands for more austerity, which is bringing down the whole of Europe. To say, folks, we have to try something we have not tried before. The truth. We're bankrupt, and we should not be given more money in order to repay loans that we cannot repay because the total amount of debt is exploding. Yes.